Arctic Ocean, March 1942. The wind screams across the frozen sea like a living thing. Waves crash against steel hulls thick with ice. In the blackness, the faint glow of a convoy stretches across the horizon. Dozens of merchant ships, each burdened with a secret the Germans were never meant to discover. Crates marked with English letters lie beneath tarps of frost. Tanks, aircraft engines, ammunition. They are bound not for Britain, but for the Soviet port of Murmansk, across one of the deadliest seas on Earth. Above, the aurora flickers through clouds, illuminating the gun turrets of British destroyers and American freighters fighting through the storm together. A lookout scans the waves. His binoculars freeze to his face. Then, a whisper through the static of the radio. Contact! Starboard! Periscope sighted! Moments later, a German U-boat breaks the surface, followed by the distant roar of aircraft engines from the fjords of occupied Norway. The trap is closing, and yet the convoy presses on, because if these ships fall, the Eastern Front might collapse with them. What the Germans are about to witness will shatter their certainty of victory, and reveal the hidden alliance that would change the war. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on Sabotage, June 22, 1941, the world watched an empire collapse in slow motion. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed within weeks. By autumn, German panzers stood at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow. Cities burned, factories were abandoned, and millions were dead or captured. The Red Army was fighting for its life with dwindling supplies and broken logistics. In Washington and London, leaders faced a brutal question. Should they help Joseph Stalin, the man who had once signed a pact with Hitler, or let the Soviet Union die and face Germany alone? The answer came from Franklin D. Roosevelt, who saw beyond ideology to strategy. "We must be the arsenal of democracy," he declared. "If Russia fell, Hitler would command all of Europe's resources. If Russia stood, Germany's strength would bleed out on the Eastern Front." On November 7, 1941, before America had even entered the war, Roosevelt approved the extension of the Lend-Lease Act to the Soviet Union. The act allowed the United States to supply war materials to any nation, resisting Axis aggression, with payment deferred until after victory. It was a gamble that would test the limits of diplomacy, logistics, and endurance. The shipments began quietly, under a shroud of secrecy. The public was told little. Even many U.S. military officers were unaware of the scale of aid being prepared for their former ideological rival. In factories across Michigan, Ohio, and California, production lines turned out Studebaker trucks, P-39 Airacobra fighters, and M3 Stuart tanks not for the U.S. Army, but for the Soviet Union. Each crate carried not just steel, but politics, a temporary bridge between two systems that despised one another. The first challenge was geography. How to deliver aid across half the world, through oceans ruled by German submarines and skies patrolled by the Luftwaffe. 3 routes were chosen. The first, across the Persian corridor, led from the Persian Gulf through Iran to the Caucasus, long, hot, and slow. The second, across the Pacific, from U.S. ports to Vladivostok, nominally safe since Japan and the USSR were not at war, but politically delicate. And the third, the fastest and most dangerous, across the Arctic Ocean to northern Russia. That final route, codenamed the Arctic Convoys, would become the most dramatic supply line of the entire war. It was a corridor of death running from Iceland and Scotland around the North Cape of Norway to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The Germans held every advantage. Airfields in Norway, naval bases packed with destroyers, and fleets of U-boats lurking beneath the waves. Yet the Allies had something the Germans did not: desperation and resolve. From the first voyage, the conditions were nightmarish. Ice formed on gun barrels and radio masts faster than sailors could chip it away. Temperatures dropped below 40 Celsius. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed almost as many men as enemy attacks. The seas themselves were as deadly as the Kriegsmarine. Ships vanished into storms, swallowed by ice, or crushed by shifting pack flows. In Berlin, German intelligence at first dismissed the convoys as minor operations, token gestures of Allied solidarity. But by winter 1941, reports began to reach the OKM, German Naval High Command, of massive shipments reaching Soviet ports. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, aircraft, fuel, and food. The numbers were staggering. Hitler, furious, demanded that the Arctic routes be choked to death. The German Navy responded with an arsenal of U-boats, long-range Focke-Wulf Condor bombers, and surface raiders like the Tirpitz and Scharnhorst. From bases in Trondheim, Narvik, and Kirkenes, they launched a campaign of interception unlike anything seen before. What followed was a logistical miracle, and a blood-soaked odyssey. Between 1941 and 1945, 41 Arctic convoys would carry more than 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union. Each voyage demanded coordination between British Admiralty, American industry, and Soviet dock workers waiting under enemy bombardment. Every ship that reached Murmansk meant more than cargo. It meant the Red Army could fight another day. And every ship that sank was a message written in ice, proof of how fragile survival could be in a war fought across oceans. By early 1942, the Germans had realized too late what they were facing. Not scattered trade ships, but an organized Allied lifeline to Moscow. A hidden alliance had taken shape in the Arctic darkness, one that Hitler's fleets would bleed themselves trying to destroy. The first Allied convoys to the Soviet Union began in August 1941, under code names that concealed their purpose, Operation Dervish and Operation Gauntlet. To the untrained eye, they were small merchant formations moving supplies north. In truth, they were the opening chords of one of the most dangerous logistical operations in modern history. From bases in Scapa Flow and Hvalfjordur, Iceland, columns of merchantmen loaded with American trucks, ammunition, aviation fuel, and aircraft spares slipped into the Arctic fog. Escorted by Royal Navy destroyers and corvettes, the voyages were short on maps and long on courage. Each ship knew that once it crossed the North Cape, it entered the hunting ground of the Kriegsmarine, waters where no one survived long in the open sea. The destination was Murmansk, the only Soviet port that remained ice-free year-round, and Arkhangelsk, open only in summer, but protected by miles of estuary and forest. These northern harbors, bombed relentlessly by the Luftwaffe, became the Soviet Union's lungs. Every crate unloaded there carried the oxygen of survival. By December 1941, as Hitler's armies stalled before Moscow, the first American supplies arrived. Soviet officers watched in disbelief as the cargo holds opened. Hundreds of Studebaker trucks, P-40 Warhawk fighters in crates, and piles of food labeled U.S. Army rations. These were machines and materials their own factories could no longer produce. Stalin, suspicious by instinct, could not hide his astonishment. "The Americans," he said to an aide, "are building a bridge across the sea." In Berlin, the reaction was fury mixed with disbelief. When reconnaissance aircraft from Luftflotte 5 spotted the first major convoy, PQ-6, plowing through the Barents Sea in January 1942, it confirmed what German intelligence had dismissed as rumor. These were not isolated shipments. They were an entire supply network protected by British warships and American engineering. Hitler was stunned that his enemies had managed to organize such a direct lifeline to his eastern foe. "How can this be?" he shouted to Admiral Raeder. "We hold Norway. We hold the Arctic. Nothing must get through." The Führer's command unleashed the full weight of the German Northern Fleet. From Trondheim, Narvik, and Kirkenes, wolf packs of U-boats were deployed along the convoy routes. Squadrons of Ju-88 and He-111 bombers were stationed on Norway's fjord airstrips. Battleships Tirpitz, Admiral Scheer, and Lutzow were assigned to intercept any large Allied formation that dared to enter the Norwegian Sea. Yet even with all these weapons, the Arctic remained treacherous for both sides. The same storms that froze Allied ships also blinded German pilots and scattered submarines. Temperatures below 40 degrees made torpedoes malfunction and machine guns freeze solid. The sea itself became a weapon, a neutral, merciless enemy that spared no one. For the sailors aboard the convoys, the experience bordered on the surreal. Days of complete darkness alternated with stretches of endless daylight. Icebergs loomed like ghosts in the fog. Men worked in layers of frozen clothing, their hands bleeding from handling cables coated with ice. Those who fell overboard lasted less than a minute before the sea took them. Yet, morale held, sustained by a sense that they were part of something larger than the war itself. Each voyage was a test of coordination between three nations that shared neither language nor ideology. British escorts shielded American cargo ships carrying supplies bound for a communist ally, all under Soviet air cover near the ports. Miscommunication was common, mistrust inevitable, but necessity overcame it. The alternative was unthinkable. The Red Army collapsing for lack of fuel and vehicles. By the spring of 1942, the convoys had become a spectacle of endurance and defiance. Each journey was a gamble with death that the Allies could not afford to lose, and the Germans could not afford to ignore. In Hitler's command bunker, reports arrived almost daily. Thousands of tons of American material reaching Soviet soil, tanks rolling through Leningrad's suburbs bearing U.S. factory marks, locomotives hauling Soviet artillery along new steel rails from the Urals to the front. The realization came too late. The Eastern Front's balance was shifting, sustained not by ideology, but by logistics. And so, in the frozen light of the Arctic Circle, the stage was set for one of the most brutal and decisive maritime battles of the war, where convoys coded PQ and QP would soon face Germany's wrath head-on. The sea was about to turn red with fire. The men who sailed the Arctic convoys lived in a world of contradictions, a landscape of beauty and horror, silence and thunder. Above them stretched skies painted with aurora light. Beneath them lay a sea colder than death itself. Each voyage was both a miracle and a slow execution, measured not by distance, but by endurance. Aboard American freighters and British escorts, sailors spoke in different accents, but shared the same ritual of survival, waking each day to scrape ice from decks, to pray the next torpedo would miss, to watch comrades vanish into a black ocean they could not enter to save them. The Arctic did not forgive mistakes. A single slip on an ice-crusted ladder could send a man into waters so cold it froze breath before a scream. The human toll began long before the first enemy attack. Frostbite stiffened fingers on gun triggers. Condensation froze inside binoculars. Food arrived as bricks of ice. Even rest was an illusion. Hammocks swayed over freezing steel as the hulls groaned under pressure. Men smoked to keep their nerves steady and kept small photographs inside oilskin pouches, the only warmth they could claim. Yet amid this misery, a strange fraternity grew. American merchantmen, British gunners, and Soviet dockhands met on frozen quaysides, exchanging cigarettes and fragments of broken languages. They were not natural allies, communists and capitalists bound together by necessity, but the Arctic stripped ideology away. In Murmansk's shattered harbor, sailors helped unload their own ships under bombing raids. Soviet women, faces blackened with soot, drove cranes that hauled U.S. trucks from the holds, while Luftwaffe bombs fell nearby. To many Western sailors, Russia seemed alien, grim, gray, and grimly determined. Soviet officers greeted them with brief handshakes and eyes hollow from years of siege. Yet gratitude, when expressed, carried weight. "We cannot fight without your help," one interpreter told a British captain. "You bring us life." Each voyage became an act of faith in a cause larger than national loyalty. The men knew they were not only supplying weapons, but hope. Every tank that reached the front, every aircraft engine delivered through the snow, kept the Eastern Front alive and drew German divisions away from Western Europe. Still, that knowledge could not erase the isolation. When convoy PQ-13 was mauled by U-boats in March 1942, survivors drifted for days among wreckage and corpses. Rescue ships could not stop. One delay meant another torpedo. Those who returned carried the silence of the Arctic inside them forever. Sailors later said the worst sound wasn't explosions or gunfire. It was the endless creaking of ice on the hull, the whisper that reminded them death was always waiting just beneath their boots. Officers aboard escort destroyers faced a different torment. Command decisions made in seconds that determined whether hundreds lived or died. When radar screens flickered with the trace of an approaching U-boat, they had to choose between chasing shadows or protecting the convoy. Every flare on the horizon might mean a burning ship. Every delay, another 100 lives lost. Even so, morale rarely collapsed. What kept the convoys alive was not command, but character. The quiet stubbornness of men who refused to surrender even to nature itself. They joked bitterly that they were icebound volunteers, but beneath the humor lay a grim pride. To have sailed on an Arctic convoy was to have walked the edge of the world and lived. The sailors' bravery went largely unseen by the public. Unlike the Normandy landings or the Battle of Britain, their struggle left no heroic photographs, only frost-bitten faces, frozen decks, and the faint radio calls that disappeared into static. Yet Churchill himself would later call the Arctic route the worst journey in the world. Each voyage demanded a moral reckoning, too. Many sailors asked themselves why they risked their lives for Stalin's regime, for a country they barely understood and did not trust. The answer came not from ideology, but from humanity, from the belief that tyranny, whether fascist or communist, could not be allowed to conquer the world unchecked. The convoys were not about politics. They were about preventing collapse. The Arctic route was also a crucible of cooperation. For perhaps the first time in history, American, British, and Soviet forces fought side by side in real time, sharing intelligence, escort formations, and supplies. British destroyers guarded American freighters carrying Soviet cargo under skies patrolled by Soviet fighters. It was chaotic, improvised, and often mistrustful. But it worked. What bound them together was not trust, but shared suffering. Ice and fear became the great equalizers. The Germans could not see it, but deep within the Arctic, alliances were being forged not by treaties, but by endurance. And though the convoys carried weapons, what they truly delivered was the proof that cooperation under fire could hold, even in a world collapsing into chaos. To the men who fought above and below those Arctic waves, it was more than a supply route. It was a battlefield unlike any other. The Arctic convoys were not defined by territory or front lines, but by invisible lines of sound, light, and timing. Every vessel, from the smallest trawler to the mighty battleship, was part of a living equation. Speed versus stealth, protection versus exposure, courage versus ice. The Germans approached the Arctic as hunters. Their plan was simple: isolate the convoys, strike fast, and vanish into the frozen fog. Yet execution was anything but simple. Admiral Rolf Karls, commanding German naval forces in Norway, had under his command dozens of U-boats, Focke-Wulf Condor reconnaissance aircraft, and the pride of the Kriegsmarine's Northern Fleet, the battleships Tirpitz and Admiral Scheer. From fjords hidden under snow-covered cliffs, these warships waited like predators, emerging only when convoys were within striking distance. Every Allied movement was a signal for German response. The moment a convoy left Iceland or Scotland, radio intercepts from the B-Dienst network tracked them. German spotter planes shadowed from above, relaying coordinates back to U-boats lurking under the ice-black water. The convoys, often 30 to 40 merchant ships strong, moved in tight formation, steel boxes moving through darkness. Their escorts were destroyers and corvettes fitted with ASDIC sonar, primitive radar, and depth charges that had to be hurled by hand when machinery froze. The Allies learned fast that in the Arctic, technology mattered less than nerve. Radar sets malfunctioned in the cold. Gun mechanisms jammed with frost. Radio signals warped in magnetic storms. What worked flawlessly in the Atlantic often failed under the Aurora's electric skies. And yet, amid this chaos, innovation thrived. The convoys became floating laboratories for survival. The British developed new de-icing systems that pumped steam through deck piping to keep weapons operational. American engineers modified the Liberty ships with reinforced hulls to withstand ice pressure. Escort crews experimented with radar-guided gunfire, and Huff-Duff, high-frequency direction-finding systems to triangulate U-boat transmissions. These crude instruments, combined with code-breaking intelligence from Bletchley Park, began to turn the tide. In a small hut in southern England, Allied cryptanalysts decoded intercepted messages from the German Enigma network. Each decrypted order gave convoys a few hours of warning to change course, to disappear into weather fronts, or to bait U-boats into traps. The Germans never fully understood how often their carefully planned ambushes failed, not because of luck, but because their messages were already being read before their ships ever sailed. Still, no amount of code-breaking could remove the danger. German U-boats attacked in wolf packs, striking at night when visibility vanished in blizzards. Torpedoes left white trails in the black water, ghostly lines of death. Crews sometimes heard them before they saw them. A hollow hiss, a rising scream, and then the eruption of steel and fire. One torpedo could rip a merchant ship in half. Those who survived the blast often froze before rescue arrived. The water was a graveyard of splintered masts and lifeboats frozen solid. Above them, the Luftwaffe added its own layer of terror. Squadrons of Ju-88 bombers swooped from bases in Banach and Trondheim, timing their attacks to coincide with the arrival of U-boats. These air-sea strikes turned the Arctic into a vertical battlefield. Merchantmen fired flak from deck guns so cold their crews wore leather gloves under wool mittens. The sky filled with smoke and tracer fire, the sea littered with burning oil, and yet, against all odds, the convoys adapted. Allied escort tactics evolved from static defense to fluid motion. Destroyers weaving patterns around the merchant ships, constantly changing speed and formation to confuse attackers. Aircraft carriers joined the convoys, launching sea hurricanes and swordfish planes to drive off German scouts. The Arctic became an arena where weather, intelligence, and invention determined survival as much as firepower. By 1943, the convoys had transformed from vulnerable caravans into formidable fleets. The Germans could still inflict damage, but the element of surprise was gone. Allied radar coverage, long-range patrol bombers, and escort carriers created a defensive shield that even the Tirpitz hesitated to challenge. When it finally did sail, the outcome would prove how far the balance had shifted. The Arctic convoys also revealed a new kind of warfare. One fought not just with weapons, but with endurance and data. Every logbook, every radar pulse, every decoded transmission was part of a vast system of coordination that spanned continents. It was a pre-digital network of human intelligence and courage, built on trust between men who had once been strangers. For Germany, the realization was crushing. Despite deploying some of its most advanced ships and submarines, Despite holding the Norwegian coast and the northern skies, it could not sever the Arctic lifeline. The Allies had found a way to defy both nature and the Reich, and in doing so, they set the stage for one of the most brutal and tragic chapters in convoy history, a disaster so great that even Hitler would call it a victory too costly to repeat. July 2nd, 1942. 35 merchant ships left. Valfjordur i Seelen, carrying 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, 4,246 trucks, and over 150,000 tons of ammunition and fuel. Their destination, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Their code name, Convoy PQ-17. It was the largest Arctic convoy yet assembled, and it was sailing straight into disaster. From the start, the voyage felt cursed. The weather, usually the convoy's greatest ally, turned against them. Ice fog thickened into blinding storms, scattering the ships across miles of sea. Radio interference crackled with static, and radar screens glowed uselessly with ghost echoes. Above the clouds, the Luftwaffe waited. Below, U-boats shadowed the formation. Every captain knew the Germans had been expecting them. What they didn't know was that in fjords hundreds of miles to the east, the battleship Tirpitz had weighed anchor. The most powerful warship in Europe, she was Hitler's floating fortress, armed with 8 15-inch guns, capable of annihilating the entire convoy in a single engagement. Her presence was enough to unnerve the entire British Admiralty. For days, PQ-17 pushed east through the Barents Sea, wrapped in fog and fear. Escorts circled constantly, corvettes, destroyers, and 2 cruisers, HMS London and HMS Norfolk. The men slept in bursts, ate frozen rations, and waited for the inevitable. Then, on July 4th, as the sun hung low over the Arctic horizon, the attack began at 12:15 p.m. Fin, France. German reconnaissance aircraft appeared out of the haze. Heinkel He-115s and Blom and Voss 138s, shadowing the convoy, relaying positions to U-boats. Moments later, torpedoes streaked through the waves. The freighter Christopher Newport went up in flame, her deck a roaring inferno. Soon after, the Navarino was hit. Men leapt into oil-slicked water that ignited seconds later. Survivors described hearing their shipmates scream as the sea itself burned. Through the night, the convoy endured wave after wave of air and submarine attack. The escorts fought back with flak and depth charges, the black sky flickering with fire. Yet the real blow came not from the enemy, but from London. In a bunker beneath the Admiralty, signals intelligence suggested the Tirpitz had left her anchorage. Fearing total destruction of the convoy, First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound issued the fateful order at 21:11 hours. Convoy PQ-17 is to scatter. To the men at sea, it was a death sentence. One by one, the escorts turned away, ordered to leave the merchantmen unprotected and join the covering force to the west. Confused captains received the signal and obeyed, thinking the German battleships were already upon them. Within hours, PQ-17 dissolved into chaos. Merchant ships fled in all directions, each alone in the Arctic void, easy prey for the waiting wolf packs. The Germans could scarcely believe their luck. For 3 days, U-boats and bombers hunted the scattered ships like sharks in a feeding frenzy. The Tirpitz never fired a single shell. Her mere rumor was enough to destroy the convoy. By July 10th, the Arctic Ocean was littered with wreckage. 24 of the 35 merchant ships were gone. Over 400 sailors perished, many freezing before rescue could reach them. Oil and debris coated the sea for miles. One survivor later wrote, "We sailed in silence. No one spoke. The sea was full of ghosts." When news reached London, Churchill called it one of the most melancholy naval episodes of the war. In Berlin, Hitler exulted, believing he had broken the Arctic lifeline forever. Goebbels's propaganda machine declared it a decisive victory, proof that the Allies could not sustain their alliance with Moscow. But beneath the headlines, a different truth emerged. The men of PQ-17 had not died in vain. They had proven, by their sacrifice, that even in catastrophe the convoys would continue. Within weeks, preparations began for the next mission. The route would be reinforced, the escorts increased, the tactics reimagined. For the sailors who survived, the memory never faded. The sight of ships burning in the midnight sun, the smell of oil and salt, the silence after each explosion. To them, PQ-17 was not just a disaster, it was the Arctic's judgment, a reminder that courage, without coordination, was not enough to defeat the sea or the enemy. Still, out of that frozen graveyard came resolve. The convoys would sail again. The Germans, stunned by the Allies' refusal to abandon the route, prepared for another assault. The Arctic War was not over. It was only entering its most decisive phase. And soon, the hunters would become the hunted. The wreckage of convoy PQ-17 still drifted across the Barents Sea when the Admiralty met in grim silence. Every commander knew what had gone wrong. Fear, confusion, and an enemy that had never needed to appear. The German Navy had won a psychological victory with smoke and rumor. For the Allies, it was a lesson carved in ice. Never again would a convoy be left undefended. By September 1942, a new formation was ready. Convoy PQ-18. 40 merchant ships, escorted by 16 warships and a single escort carrier, HMS Avenger. They would sail the same route, but this time with teeth. The British Admiralty poured everything learned from PQ-17 into the plan. Air cover, radar sweeps, coordinated defense patterns, and constant intelligence updates from Bletchley Park. The Arctic, once a killing field, was about to become a proving ground. From occupied Norway, the Germans watched in disbelief as the convoys resumed. They had expected hesitation, perhaps months of delay. Instead, only 8 weeks after the catastrophe, Allied masts again appeared over the horizon. Admiral Rolf Karls prepared his U-boats and torpedo bombers. Hitler, enraged, ordered Tirpitz and Admiral Scheer to stand by. He wanted annihilation, a second massacre to erase Allied defiance. On September 13th, the Germans struck. Dozens of He-111 and Ju-88 bombers descended through snow clouds, releasing torpedoes that skimmed across the waves. The convoy answered with an umbrella of flak. British and American gunners fired until their hands blistered through their gloves, the air thick with smoke and tracers. From HMS Avenger, sea hurricanes roared into the storm, diving headlong into bomber formations at point-blank range. For 2 days, the sky burned. 10 merchant ships were lost, but 27 reached Russia intact, and the escorts sank 13 German aircraft and 3 U-boats. PQ-18 had not escaped unscathed, but it had survived, bloodied yet unbroken. The message was unmistakable. The Arctic route would endure. The Germans had thrown everything they could, and failed. From that point onward, the U-boat war in the north became a slow retreat. The Luftwaffe's Torpedostaffel 5, once triumphant, was decimated. Pilots called the convoys Eishölle, the ice hell. Then, in December 1943, came the final reckoning. The Battle of North Cape. Convoy JW-55B was bound for Murmansk, shadowed by the great German battleship Scharnhorst, sister to the Tirpitz and scourge of the Atlantic. She had already sunk millions of tons of shipping and now moved north to intercept. But the Allies were waiting. Using ultra-intelligence and radar triangulation, Admiral Bruce Fraser lured the Scharnhorst into a trap beneath the polar night. On December 26th, British cruisers made radar contact in snow and sleet. For hours, they traded blind broadsides through the darkness. Shells burst in mid-air, illuminating the sea in brief flashes of orange. Then, at point-blank range, the battleship Duke of York joined the fight. Its radar-directed guns found the Scharnhorst's range with surgical precision. By evening, the German flagship was ablaze from bow to stern. At 7:45 p.m., a final torpedo struck amidships. The explosion split her open. She rolled and went down in the freezing water. Of her nearly 2,000 crew, only 36 survived. The Kriegsmarine's northern threat was finished. When the news reached Hitler's headquarters, he exploded in rage, accusing his admirals of cowardice. But beneath the anger was realization. The Arctic passage could no longer be stopped. From that moment, Tirpitz would remain confined to Norwegian fjords, hunted from the air until British bombers finally destroyed her in 1944. The Germans had begun the Arctic campaign, believing they could choke the Soviet Union by sea. Instead, they had bled away their fleet in frozen waters, fighting an enemy that refused to yield. For the Allies, these victories were more than revenge for PQ-17. They were proof that technology, coordination, and sheer determination could overcome even the deadliest environment. Radar, decryption, escort carriers, and relentless adaptation had turned the Arctic from graveyard to fortress. By early 1944, the convoys sailed with clockwork precision. Ships ran in double columns, their paths protected by destroyer screens and distant air patrols. Soviet pilots from Murmansk provided final leg coverage, their fighters circling over the White Mountains as the ships slipped into port. The system that had once cost thousands of lives now functioned like a single machine. In Berlin, the shock was total. Reports showed a steady flood of Allied material arriving in Russia despite every effort to destroy it. Stalin now received more than supplies. He received confirmation that the Western Allies would not let him fall. The Germans had lost the invisible war of logistics. The convoys had not only defied the Arctic, they had rewired the balance of the Eastern Front itself. And as the new year dawned over the polar horizon, the tide of war was turning, driven by the engines of ships that refused to die. By the winter of 1943, the convoys had achieved what no grand strategy or diplomatic negotiation could. They had kept the Soviet Union alive. Every ship that reached Murmansk or Arkhangelsk carried the bones of the Red Army's recovery: steel, fuel, food, and faith. Without them, the Eastern Front might have frozen into defeat. In total, by early 1944, over 4 million tons of American and British cargo had reached Soviet ports. It was a staggering figure, a river of supplies flowing through ice and blood. Among the shipments were 12,000 tanks, 11,400 aircraft, 400,000 trucks, and nearly 500,000 tons of aluminum and aviation fuel. The Soviet Union, which had lost much of its industrial heartland to the German invasion, suddenly found itself able to move and fight again. The effect was immediate. Soviet logistics, once crippled, transformed. The rugged Studebaker US-6 trucks became the backbone of the Red Army's mobility, carrying troops, artillery, and ammunition across thousands of kilometers of shattered roads. Soviet soldiers nicknamed them Studebakersky and swore by them. These American vehicles pulled the Katyusha rocket launchers that thundered across the front lines from Kursk to Berlin. Even the skies over Russia changed. Hundreds of P-39 Airacobra fighters, originally dismissed by U.S. pilots, found new life in Soviet hands. Their heavy 37mm cannons proved perfect for dogfighting at low altitude. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin, who scored 59 aerial victories, flew an American-built Airacobra. To his enemies, it was a ghost with American wings and a Russian soul. Yet what mattered most was not just the machines, but the fuel that fed them. Allied convoys delivered millions of barrels of aviation and motor fuel, refined to a quality the Soviets could not yet produce in volume. Every offensive from Stalingrad to Kursk was powered, in part, by oil that had crossed the Arctic under German fire. The transformation was not lost on Stalin. Privately, he acknowledged to his generals that, without the Lend-Lease trucks, we could not have matched the Germans in movement. But in public, he remained cautious. The alliance was one of necessity, not friendship. Soviet propaganda credited the Red Army's courage alone. Still, Moscow knew the truth. And so did Berlin. German intelligence reports from 1944 revealed growing despair. Agents noted that new Soviet formations appeared equipped with foreign-type vehicles and motorized columns in abundance. The Wehrmacht's officers, long confident in their logistical superiority, began to realize that they were facing a modernized, mechanized enemy, one fueled by American industry. Meanwhile, in Britain and the United States, the Arctic sailors who had made it possible returned home quietly. There were no parades for the men of the convoys. Their mission had been secret, their success overshadowed by the great land battles of Europe. Many never spoke of it again, but those who did remembered it as the coldest, loneliest, and most honorable duty of the war. The convoys also altered the strategic map of the Allies themselves. By sustaining the Soviet Union, they prevented Hitler from redirecting his full strength westward. The blood that froze in the Barents Sea bought time. Time for the United States to arm, for Britain to prepare, for D-Day to become possible. Every truck delivered to the Red Army meant fewer German tanks waiting on the beaches of Normandy. By the end of 1944, even the Germans could no longer deny it. Reports from the Arctic Command admitted that the enemy supply route through the northern seas cannot be permanently closed. The cost of maintaining the blockade exceeded any gain. Hitler's once proud northern fleet was crippled. Its surface ships sunk, its U-boats destroyed or stranded, its air power spent. The Arctic War had been won not by overwhelming firepower, but by endurance, the humankind. In that frozen theater, courage became a currency, and the men who paid it bought not only victory, but survival. The convoys had done more than resupply a nation. They had reshaped the very outcome of the war. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the Arctic route faded from the headlines, but its legacy lingered like the cold itself. The alliance that had carried the convoys was already fraying. What had once been necessity was turning into rivalry. Within a year, the Cold War would divide the very nations that had shared that frozen sea. In Moscow, the official narrative shifted quickly. Soviet history emphasized the heroism of its own soldiers, the sacrifice of its people, and the self-sufficiency of its industry. The Lend-Lease program, that lifeline of American steel and fuel, was rebranded as marginal, almost trivial. Textbooks made little mention of the Arctic convoys. The truth was politically inconvenient. Stalin wanted victory to appear wholly Soviet, unmarred by foreign help. But in the private corridors of the Kremlin, memory lingered. Archival records later revealed that Soviet commanders regularly studied Allied convoy reports, analyzing escort tactics and naval coordination. They understood what those missions had cost. For every ton of cargo that reached Murmansk, a man somewhere had frozen, drowned, or burned to deliver it. In the West, recognition came slowly. For decades, Arctic convoy veterans remained unsung, their mission classified and their sacrifice overshadowed by more glamorous battles. Britain awarded medals only in 2013, 70 years after the fact. For the Americans, whose merchant mariners endured the same storms and torpedoes, acknowledgement was even more scarce. They returned to civilian life, carrying the memory of ice and fire in silence. And yet, in the few quiet moments of the early Cold War, gestures of respect crossed the new divide. In 1969, at a memorial in Murmansk, Soviet officers laid wreaths alongside British naval veterans. There were no speeches of ideology that day, only shared glances. Men who had once fought for each other, now separated by politics, but united by what they had survived. The strategic echoes of the convoys reached far beyond remembrance. The operation had demonstrated the power of logistics as a weapon. The idea that industrial might, coordinated across oceans, could crush an enemy without a single decisive battle. It was a philosophy that would shape modern warfare and Cold War planning alike. The same systems of convoy protection, intelligence coordination, and joint naval command evolved into the backbone of NATO's maritime doctrine decades later. For Germany, the Arctic campaign left scars of its own. The Northern Fleet had consumed enormous resources and lives for minimal gain. Hundreds of U-boats and aircraft were lost in futile attempts to stop the flow of supplies. After the war, surviving German officers quietly admitted that the Arctic front had been a frozen graveyard of opportunity. The Kriegsmarine had bled away its strength chasing ships that kept coming, no matter the cost. Even now, the statistics remain staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, over 1,400 merchant ships and 85 warships took part in the Arctic convoys. At least 104 merchant vessels and 18 escorts were lost, along with nearly 3,000 Allied sailors. Their resting place is the bottom of the Barents Sea, a steel graveyard of liberty ships, destroyers, and oil drums, preserved in the eternal cold. In Murmansk, where rusting cranes still rise over the docks, the memory endures. A granite monument faces the harbor, inscribed in Russian and English, "To those who gave their lives so that others might live in freedom." Veterans who return here each year, British, American, and Russian alike, speak not of politics, but of endurance. They remember the glare of searchlights on snow, the sound of ice grinding against hulls, the smell of diesel and salt. They remember the silence that followed after a ship went down. The Arctic convoys were never meant to be legendary. They were meant to be practical. Supply runs, not heroics. And yet, they became one of the war's purest symbols of cooperation under impossible conditions. They proved that courage could be industrial, that solidarity could exist even among uneasy allies, and that survival sometimes depends on those you least expect. Long after the guns fell silent, the sea kept their secret, and in its frozen depths lies the quiet answer to one of history's coldest truths: that victory, in the end, belongs to those who endure longest against the dark. The Barents Sea today is quiet. Beneath its still gray surface lie the rusting hulls of merchantmen and destroyers, the bones of a war fought in silence and snow. The Arctic wind still howls across Murmansk's cliffs, carrying echoes of engines long stilled, of men who sailed into a frozen horizon, knowing most would not return. Time has softened the edges of the story, but the truth endures. Those convoys were more than ships and steel. They were the veins through which flowed the lifeblood of alliance, a partnership forged not from friendship, but from the shared necessity of survival. Americans, Britons, and Soviets worked together in a place where politics froze and only duty remained warm. Every ton of fuel that crossed that sea was a defiance of distance. Every man who chipped ice from a gun mount in -40 kept a promise to people he would never meet. Together, they proved that endurance can be a form of courage, the kind that outlasts glory, outlasts fear, outlasts even the war itself. In Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, memorials still stand, granite shapes against the snow, facing west. Their inscriptions are simple. They gave their tomorrow for our today. Few tourists visit them. The sea doesn't need an audience. It remembers on its own. The Germans called it a waste of ships. The Allies called it a duty. History calls it something rarer. A moment when humanity, surrounded by ice and fire, chose to keep faith across an ocean. The Arctic convoys did not win the war by themselves, but they carried something the war could not destroy. Proof that even in the darkest winter, courage can still find its way through the storm.